Halloween night, 1979. Fog hangs low over Interstate 35, just north of Georgetown, Texas. Traffic is sparse, truckers rolling south, families heading home from costume parties. A pair of headlights cuts through the dark and glints off something bright in a drainage ditch. A driver slows down, backs up, and realizes it isn't trash. It's a body, a young woman naked except for a pair of orange socks. Unit 75 to dispatch, possible homicide, female, no ID, send sheriff's investigators and coroner. The voice crackles, then fades into the static of the night. For the next 4 decades, the woman in those orange socks would have no name, only a case number and a nickname. This is the story of how a Jane Doe became someone, and how the man convicted of her murder may not have been her killer at all. Orange socks. The 1979 Texas mystery that took 40 years to name. Before we begin, a warning. This story includes discussion of violence and sexual assault. All details come from public records, court documents, and verified law enforcement reports. Some identifying details have been withheld to respect privacy. If you believe forgotten victims deserve their names back, take a second to subscribe. It helps these stories reach more people and keeps the past from being buried again. Back then, detectives had nothing to go on. No purse, no license, no missing person report that matched. Just a Jane Doe found along a busy interstate and a pair of bright orange socks that would haunt them for decades. Her file read simply, female, white, approximate age 20 to 30, unidentified. The case number was 79 to 1031, the date her body was found. For years, investigators called her Orange Socks. To them, she was a mystery. To the world, she was a ghost story told on Halloween. But beneath that nickname was a real person, someone with a family who never stopped, wondering why she didn't come home. This case isn't just about solving a murder. It's about how truth can be twisted, how justice can go wrong, and how science can rewrite a story the system thought it already knew. Before we trace that journey, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. It's always powerful to see how far these stories travel. Tonight we'll revisit the Halloween night discovery, the controversial confession that closed the case too soon, and the forensic breakthrough that finally gave her a name, Debra Louise Jackson. This is the story of Orange Socks. It was just after 8 o'clock on Halloween night 1979, when a highway worker driving southbound on Interstate 35 noticed something strange along the shoulder. He thought it was a pile of discarded clothes, maybe a costume blown from a passing car. When he stopped to look, the sight froze him in place. Lying face down in a concrete drainage ditch was the body of a young woman. She had no identification, no purse, no shoes, only a pair of bright orange socks pulled up to mid-calf. Within minutes, deputies from the Williamson County Sheriff's Office arrived. They noted how clean the scene was. There were no tire marks in the mud, no signs of a struggle on the gravel. The woman had been placed carefully, as if someone wanted her to be found yet not immediately recognized. Investigators estimated she had been dead less than 24 hours. The cause quickly apparent: ligature strangulation. A deep, uniform bruise circled her neck. The first task was simple and impossible at once: find out who she was. They guessed her age between 20 and 30. She was 5'6", around 110 pounds, auburn brown hair, hazel eyes. Her fingernails were clean, her teeth well cared for. She wore no wedding ring. A small birthmark on her left shoulder blade and a faint surgical scar on her ankle were the only distinguishing marks noted in the initial report. An autopsy confirmed what deputies already suspected. She had been strangled with a length of fabric or rope. There were bruises on her inner arms suggesting restraint. She had eaten a meal of hamburger and French fries roughly an hour before death. Toxicology found no drugs or alcohol. Whoever she was, she had not expected to die that night. By the following morning, the body had been transported to the Travis County Medical Examiner's office in Austin. Because no identification had surfaced, she was logged under the date of discovery. Case 79, 10-31. Female, white, unidentified. A fingerprint card was created, dental impressions taken, photographs shot for law enforcement bulletins. When officers tried to run her prints through state files, nothing matched. She wasn't in any criminal database, any employment record, or any known missing person report. Investigators searched the culvert again in daylight. They found a towel a few yards away, a single cigarette butt, and a small turquoise ring missing its stone. Inside the towel, they detected faint traces of engine grease, but no blood. Nearby lay a paper matchbook printed with the logo of a motel in Henrietta, Oklahoma, 300 miles north. The evidence hinted she had been traveling, maybe hitchhiking. But where from and with whom? Reporters from the local Georgetown Record met deputies at the scene. One of them, unable to shake the image of those orange socks against gray concrete, used the description in his front-page headline, "Unidentified woman found wearing orange socks." The name stuck. Within days, every officer, journalist, and volunteer in Williamson County was referring to her that way. Orange socks. A color instead of a name. Detectives began combing through missing person reports statewide. They called police departments in Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, even across state lines. No one reported a missing woman matching her description. They checked bus terminals, motels, truck stops. A waitress in Waco thought she might have seen a girl like that a few nights earlier, traveling with an older man who paid cash. But memory is fragile. When shown photos later, she wasn't sure. Days stretched into weeks. The investigation kept circling the same dead ends. Because her hands were free of calluses and her teeth well maintained, detectives speculated she might have been from a middle-class background. Her socks were mass-produced but relatively new. The ring's make suggested a souvenir piece, perhaps from roadside jewelry stands common along Route 66. Everything pointed to movement. Someone on the road, between towns, easily forgotten. By mid-November, the county buried her in a simple grave marked Jane Doe, 79 to 1031. A small wooden cross, white paint flaking in the Texas sun, was the only memorial. The sheriff promised to revisit the case when new information arises. None did. Years later, retired deputies would still recall how the case haunted them. One said he drove that stretch of highway every week for decades, slowing down instinctively near mile marker 268. Another admitted he kept her case photo in his wallet, a reminder of the one he couldn't solve. Yet, even in those early days, small details hinted that the story might not be so straightforward. A farmer a mile from the scene reported hearing a vehicle stop on the shoulder the night before, the distinctive hiss of air brakes, then silence. Another motorist claimed to have seen a woman walking along the frontage road around 7 p.m. wearing light-colored clothes and bright socks. Neither lead went anywhere. Both were logged and forgotten. Forensic science in 1979 could do little more. DNA testing didn't exist. Fiber analysis required clean samples they didn't have. They stored her clothing and tissue slides in evidence lockers, never realizing those scraps would one day rewrite the case. As months passed, the community moved on, but the detectives assigned to Orange Socks couldn't. They reviewed truck stop security logs, questioned long-haul drivers, followed rumors of a transient couple seen arguing near Temple. Every tip collapsed under scrutiny. Without a name, there was no way to trace her life backward, no family to contact, no baseline for comparison. By Christmas 1979, the investigation was officially inactive. Unsolved. A statistic in a yearly report. The case file would sit untouched for years, gathering dust until 4 years later, a drifter named Henry Lee Lucas began confessing to murders across the country and included the woman in the orange socks among his claimed victims. But that part of the story belongs to a later chapter. For now, picture the silence after the patrol cars left that Halloween night. The wind over the asphalt, the sound of distant traffic, and a name no one knew how to speak. For a while, deputies tried to keep the case alive. They kept her photo pinned to the bulletin board above the copy machine, just in case a visitor from another county recognized her face. Each holiday season, someone would tape a small paper angel next to her file. By spring of 1980, even that small ritual faded. The file labeled 791031F became one of hundreds stacked in the Williamson County Evidence Vault, sealed envelopes, Polaroids, handwritten reports yellowing at the edges. Inside one folder sat the orange socks, sealed in a plastic bag, still faintly smelling of disinfectant. No one could have guessed those same socks would one day provide the DNA that named her. Throughout the 1980s, technology in forensic labs began to change, but slowly, and almost never in rural Texas. Computers were entering police work, but fingerprint databases were still local, and DNA was a theory being tested in a few academic labs. The investigators assigned to the case rotated in and out, each hoping a new missing person notice might finally match. None did. Every few years, a lead surfaced. A runaway reported from Dallas, a hitchhiker missing from Oklahoma, a young woman who disappeared on her way to Austin. Each time the comparison failed. Different dental pattern, wrong height, different age. Every failure chipped away at morale. Some detectives began calling her the Halloween Girl. Others just our ghost. In 1983, Henry Lee Lucas confessed to her murder. For law enforcement desperate for answers, the confession seemed like a gift. Lucas provided details about the body's location, the socks, even the color of the ring. He said he'd picked her up near Oklahoma City and strangled her during an argument. It fit almost too neatly. The case file was reopened, and after a single interview, prosecutors accepted the confession. The woman known only as Orange Socks now had an accused killer. But something about the confession bothered investigators who had been at the original scene. Lucas's timeline didn't fit. Gas station receipts placed him hundreds of miles away that night. The autopsy notes he quoted were never made public, yet the details he gave were partly wrong. He said she wore shoes. She hadn't. He claimed he dumped her body in a wooded area. It was open roadside. Still, the confession stuck. Lucas was convicted and sentenced to death in 1984, later becoming infamous for claiming responsibility for more than 200 murders nationwide. The conviction closed the case on paper, but not in conscience. Many local officers doubted him quietly. They had seen the original evidence. They knew his version was impossible. Still, bureaucratically, Orange Socks was now a solved homicide, and solved cases don't get new funding. Through the 1990s, the physical evidence sat untouched, while the name on the file never changed. Advances like the FBI's new CODIS DNA database made national headlines, but counties had to submit samples voluntarily and pay for testing. Williamson County's budget didn't stretch that far. When analysts revisited the evidence in 1999, they discovered the tissue slides were still usable, but the chain of custody paperwork was incomplete. Without a judge's order, nothing could be tested, so she remained a Jane Doe. No identity, no real justice, just a line on a spreadsheet somewhere in Austin. Female to 79-10-31. Found Georgetown, Texas. Orange Socks. Case closed. For the families of missing women across the state, those bare descriptions meant endless false hope. Dozens of mothers called the sheriff's office each year, asking if the unidentified woman might be their daughter. Most left disappointed but grateful that someone still answered the phone. By the early 2000s, a new generation of detectives began looking at the forgotten cold cases again. They weren't haunted by pride or old rivalries. They wanted to see what modern tools could do. In 2001, the evidence from the Orange Socks case was transferred to climate-controlled storage and catalogued for possible DNA profiling. But again, budget delays pushed testing to the sidelines. Around that time, forensic artist Karen T. produced a new facial reconstruction from the original skull. The clay model depicted a young woman with a calm, almost serene expression and wide-set eyes. When the image was released to newspapers, dozens of tips came in from around the country. A few looked promising: a waitress from Missouri, a hitchhiker from New Mexico, but each comparison ended the same way: close, but not her. In 2010, volunteers with the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System uploaded her file into a public database. For the first time, anyone with internet access could view her facial reconstructions and basic information. True crime bloggers began writing about her, giving the old nickname new life online. Commenters speculated endlessly: a drifter, a runaway, a victim of a truck stop serial killer. The mystery grew, but the truth remained out of reach. Then, in 2016, the Texas Department of Public Safety commissioned an updated digital composite. This time, the 3D rendering looked more realistic, so much that some viewers swore they recognized her. A few sent emails saying she looked like a girl they once worked with, or a cousin who vanished in the late 70s. None of those tips panned out. Still, each attempt meant someone, somewhere, cared enough to keep her story alive. Meanwhile, in labs across the country, forensic genealogy was starting to revolutionize cold cases. The technique used small fragments of DNA and compared them to open consumer databases to locate distant relatives. At first it was reserved for the biggest cases, serial killers, national headlines, but soon smaller counties began to see its potential. In 2018, one of those counties was Williamson. A new detective assigned to the cold case unit dusted off the Orange Sox file and reached out to the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit specializing in identifying long unidentified victims. The lab technicians extracted trace DNA from a preserved hair root on one of the Orange Sox. It was degraded but sufficient to build a partial genetic profile. They uploaded it to the genealogy database GEDmatch, hoping for a distant cousin, any match at all. Months passed. Then, late in 2018, the computer returned a small cluster of hits, third and fourth cousins, scattered across the Midwest. Volunteers began building family trees backward, connecting branches, tracing surnames. The web of relations pointed toward a cluster of families from Abilene, Texas. For the first time in 40 years, investigators had a geographic anchor. If the genealogy results were correct, the unknown woman wasn't from another state or some transient circuit. She was a Texas native. The next step was clear. Contact living relatives and confirm through direct DNA comparison. Early 2019 brought the confirmation that would change everything. The partial match linked to a woman who had never stopped wondering about her missing sister, Debra Louise Jackson, last seen leaving Abilene in 1977. The DNA confirmed it. Orange Sox had a name. But before that revelation could be made public, the sheriff's office spent weeks verifying timelines, cross-checking employment records, and preparing the announcement. For 4 decades, she had been the nameless woman in the culvert. Now she would be restored to her identity, her family, and her story. That moment, when a Jane Doe becomes a person again, marks the true turning point of any cold case. For Williamson County, it came nearly 40 years too late. For the Jackson family, it was the first hint that their missing daughter's story had finally been found. When the phone rang inside the Williamson County Sheriff's Office in 1983, it seemed like the miracle every cold case detective dreams of. A drifter already in custody for multiple murders, Henry Lee Lucas, had just confessed to killing the unidentified woman in the Orange Sox. After 4 years of silence, the case suddenly had a voice. Lucas claimed he had picked up a young hitchhiker near Oklahoma City on Halloween 1979. He said they argued after she demanded money, and that he strangled her with his bare hands before dumping the body by the highway outside Georgetown. He described her as petite, mid-20s, brownish hair, maybe auburn, and wearing only socks. It was close enough to the truth that investigators wanted to believe him. Texas law enforcement at the time was under immense pressure to close open murders. Lucas was already admitting to dozens of killings in multiple states, each one bringing closure to families and headlines to departments. Detectives across the country were flying to Texas to question him. Some left believing they had solved their oldest cases. Others left uneasy, sensing something rehearsed in his tone. Still, by the mid-1980s, Lucas had become a one-man solution to America's backlog of unsolved murders. In Williamson County, his confession to the Orange Sox case seemed airtight on the surface. He knew she'd been strangled, knew where the body had been found, and could describe the socks. To a jury, that might sound like inside information, but in truth, most of those details had been printed in local newspapers years earlier. The scene photographs and autopsy summaries were accessible to anyone, inside a police department, and Lucas had spent months being shown old case files as investigators paraded him from one jurisdiction to another. He was indicted for capital murder and brought to trial in 1984. The prosecution presented his confession as the centerpiece of its case. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no blood, no fibers linking him to the victim. Just his word and the belief that his word had weight. The jury convicted him, and the judge imposed the death penalty. For a while, Texas held Lucas up as proof that even the most hopeless mysteries could be solved through persistence. Press conferences announced closure. Reporters wrote that Orange Socks had finally found justice. Few people outside law enforcement noticed how thin the evidence really was. Then, cracks began to appear. A reporter from the Dallas Times Herald obtained travel records showing that during the week of Halloween 1979, Lucas was working in Florida with his partner Otis Toole, over 1,000 miles away. A paycheck, a witness statement, and a time-stamped receipt placed him there the very day the Georgetown body was discovered. He couldn't have driven back to Texas, committed the murder, and returned in time. When confronted, Lucas shrugged and said he might have gotten the dates mixed up. But he kept the confession intact. He'd already confessed to so many killings that one more or less hardly mattered. By 1985, investigators from other states were noticing the same problem. If every confession were true, Lucas would have needed to drive millions of miles in a few years, committing murders almost daily. Travel logs proved impossible. The so-called Lucas Task Force, created by the Texas Rangers to verify his stories, quietly began to realize they'd built a monster of their own making. A system where one man's false memories or manipulations could rewrite hundreds of files. Inside prison, Lucas enjoyed the attention. He was interviewed constantly, fed regularly, treated as a celebrity inmate. Each time he confessed, he earned another visit, another meal, another audience. The machine kept turning. For the Orange Socks case, the flaws became undeniable. The prosecution's only corroboration was that Lucas knew about the Orange Socks themselves. But copies of the autopsy report listing that detail had circulated through law enforcement bulletins before he ever spoke. There was no trace evidence linking him to the woman, and no witnesses ever placed him in Texas that week. Still, the conviction stood. In the early 1990s, the Texas Attorney General's office began reviewing the hundreds of Lucas confessions. The findings were staggering. At least 200 of them were physically impossible. He'd claimed murders in states where he'd never set foot, at times when he was in custody elsewhere. The credibility of every case he touched collapsed. Governor George W. Bush, after reviewing the inconsistencies, commuted Lucas's death sentence in 1998, the only clemency of Bush's tenure. The official reason: insufficient evidence. But even that didn't reverse the conviction. On paper, Lucas remained guilty of murdering Orange Socks. Until his death in 2001, Texas had no mechanism to vacate the judgment once the file was closed, and the defendant deceased. The problem went deeper than one man's lies. It revealed how desperate law enforcement had been to deliver closure in the face of public fear. The 1970s had left Texas haunted by serial killer headlines, and agencies were underfunded, overwhelmed, and eager for any resolution. When Lucas volunteered confessions that tied up loose ends, they accepted them. The victims' names were easier to type into a solved column than to admit. Uncertainty for the family of Debra Jackson, though they wouldn't know for decades that she was the woman behind the nickname. The false confession was another theft. It stole the chance for a real investigation. Evidence that might have been re-examined or retested was boxed away, labeled closed by conviction. Potential witnesses grew older, memories faded, documents disappeared. The truth calcified under the weight of official closure. Even some of the Texas Rangers who had once championed Lucas later apologized. One called it the biggest mistake of my career. Another admitted the system had wanted to believe him because the alternative, that dozens of killers were still at large, was too frightening. From his cell, Lucas occasionally recanted, then unrecanted, depending on who was listening. He claimed he'd been pressured to confess, that officers fed him details, that he liked the attention. Most observers came to see him as a pathological liar whose stories blended fantasy and fact, until even he couldn't tell the difference. When he died in 2001 of heart failure, the Orange Sox file remained technically solved, though every serious investigator now doubted it. It would take almost 2 more decades, and the advent of forensic genealogy, before that judgment would truly be challenged. By the time Debra Jackson's name surfaced in 2019, most of the people who had built the Lucas myth were gone or retired. What remained was a question that still unsettles Texas law enforcement. If Lucas didn't kill her, then who did? That question, unasked for 40 years, became the new center of the case, and the search for its answer would lead investigators back to the evidence long dismissed. The orange socks, the towel, the ring, and the truth buried inside a single hair root that technology had finally learned how to read. For most people in Williamson County, the woman in the orange socks slowly faded into the background noise of local law. But somewhere far from Georgetown, her family kept waiting for a phone call that never came. Debra Jackson's mother, Mary Louise Jackson, lived in Abilene back then. She worked double shifts at a nursing home and raised 3 children mostly on her own. When Debra stopped writing home in the late 1970s, Mary Louise assumed her daughter had simply chosen freedom. Debra was 23, restless, and determined to see more of the world than West Texas offered. In those days, no one called it going missing. Young people drifted from job to job, and if letters stopped arriving, families told themselves not to worry. It was easier than believing the worst. For years, Mary Louise would walk to the mailbox and look for Debra's handwriting. Neat cursive on plain envelopes, usually signed Love Deb. By 1980, those envelopes had stopped. She still kept a drawer of them, bundled with a rubber band, even after she moved houses. When asked about her daughter, she always said the same thing. Debra's working somewhere near Austin. She'll visit soon. The illusion helped her sleep. No one in the family knew that just 90 miles away, Debra's body lay in an unmarked grave labeled Jane Doe, 79-10-31. For her younger sister, Carolyn Jackson, the silence was heavier. She was only 15 when Debra left Abilene, but she remembered everything. The denim jacket Debra loved, the turquoise ring, the way she hummed along with the radio while cooking breakfast. Carolyn wrote to her twice a month and waited by the phone every Sunday. When Debra didn't answer the Christmas call in 1979, she felt something snap inside her. Still, everyone around her said not to imagine bad things. Debra's just being Debra, they said. She'll turn up. She never did. The 1980s rolled into the 1990s. The Jacksons moved houses, changed jobs, and tried to live around the empty space their daughter left behind. They filed a missing person report in 1984, but without clear proof of travel or last contact, it went nowhere. In those pre-digital years, databases didn't cross-reference across counties. If one department typed Debra Jackson into a file cabinet in Abilene, no one in Georgetown would ever see it. For families like theirs, disappearance meant living in suspended time. Holidays carried a ritual of pretending, an extra plate at the table, a prayer whispered too softly for guests to hear. Every knock at the door made hearts race. Every news report about a found body brought dread and a strange, guilty hope. Maybe it's her, so at least we'll know. Meanwhile, detectives in Georgetown had no family to contact, no missing person link. Their empathy was genuine but abstract. A nameless victim can't be mourned the same way a daughter can. The case turned from grief into paperwork, from a person into evidence. By the mid-1990s, Mary Louise was older, her health failing. She still kept a photograph of Debra on the dresser, the corners frayed from years of dusting. When visitors asked, she smiled politely and said her daughter lived near Dallas now, busy with work. It was the story she told herself most nights to stay sane. Across Texas, other families lived similar half-lives. The state held hundreds of unidentified women in morgues and potters' fields, victims of accidents, murders, or simply time. Each one represented a missing person somewhere else, the mirror image of a file waiting to match. But without technology, those mirrors stayed dark. In 2001, when the new century arrived and forensic DNA began appearing on television crime shows, Carolyn Jackson wondered if science could help. She didn't know where to start. There was no public database, no hotline for families with old disappearances. She kept clipping newspaper articles about new techniques and stored them in a shoebox marked, "For Debra." A decade later, when the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System went online, she submitted her sister's information herself. Hair color, eye color, approximate height, last known city. She attached one scanned photo, Debra in front of the Abilene City pool sign, 1977. She clicked submit and prayed. Weeks passed, no reply. The entry joined tens of thousands of others, floating in the database's quiet expanse. Then the true crime community found it. Amateur sleuths and retired detectives began trading information on message boards, comparing unidentified cases with missing person files. One night in 2017, Carolyn stumbled across a thread discussing orange socks. Someone posted the digital composite made by the Texas Department of Public Safety and commented, "She reminds me of a girl from Abilene who vanished in the 70s. Carolyn stared at the photo for hours. The nose was wrong, the eyes softer, but something about the mouth, that faint half-smile, was hers. Still, hope had burned her too many times before. She closed the laptop and tried to forget it. In early 2019, a detective from Williamson County called. He asked for confirmation of her address, then asked a question that made her tremble. "Ma'am, did your sister ever wear a turquoise ring?" She didn't need to hear anything else. She knew. For nearly 40 years, the Jackson family had lived without a body, without an obituary, without a name to place on a gravestone. They had celebrated birthdays that might have been memorials, mourned in private, and aged under the weight of uncertainty. When DNA finally confirmed the match that summer, Carolyn drove to Georgetown to see the grave herself. The wooden cross was long gone, replaced by a small granite marker that still read, "Jane Doe, 79-10-31. Standing there, she whispered, "Your name is Debra Jackson. I'm sorry it took so long." For detectives, that moment marked a procedural success. For Carolyn, it was both relief and grief at once, the collision of knowing and losing all over again. The family arranged a new headstone inscribed with her full name, date of birth, and the words, "At last, home." The case, however, was far from finished. Identifying Debra didn't reveal who had killed her or why. The conviction against Henry Lee Lucas still sat in the record books, untouched. But now the woman behind the nickname had a history, a family, and a voice willing to fight for the truth. For every family still searching for their own missing person, Debra's identification was a sign of hope, proof that even after 40 years, technology and perseverance could cross the distance between loss and closure. But it also stood as a warning that bureaucracy and bad assumptions can bury truth almost as deeply as the ground itself. In Texas alone, hundreds of unidentified victims remain nameless. Each one is someone's daughter, son, or sibling, a human story waiting for its reunion. And for the Jacksons, knowing Debra's fate was only half of justice. The other half would depend on whether the real killer could ever be found. By 2018, the Orange Socks case was a ghost that refused to rest. Every few years, a new detective would pull the file, read the same brittle pages, and set it back down. Nothing changed until forensic genealogy entered the room. That year, the DNA Doe Project, a volunteer nonprofit using consumer genealogy tools to identify unknown victims, began working with small police departments across the United States. Its approach was radical. Instead of searching for direct matches in criminal databases, it compared anonymous crime scene DNA to public genealogy sites, building family trees backward until a living relative appeared. It had already cracked several decades-old mysteries. Williamson County detectives wondered if it could do the same for theirs. The challenge was whether any usable DNA remained. After nearly 40 years, most biological samples from 1979 were degraded, stored in aging envelopes long before modern preservation standards. Technicians combed through every sealed bag and found a single promising sample, a few hairs recovered from the orange socks themselves, stored between glass slides by the original pathologist. It was the last physical connection to the woman no one had named. The sample was shipped under chain of custody to a specialized lab in California. There, scientists began the slow process of extracting what little genetic material time had spared. Weeks passed. Then, late one night, the lab director sent a cautious email to the sheriff's office. "We have viable DNA." With that message, a 40-year-old file breathed again. Building a genetic profile from so little material was like reconstructing a novel from scattered pages. Every fragment had to be read, aligned, verified. After months of analysis, the lab produced enough genetic markers to upload to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database used by millions of Americans who tested their ancestry. The hope was to find a relative, second, third, even fourth cousin, anyone whose DNA overlapped in the right way. The upload happened quietly one Friday evening in late 2018. Detectives went home expecting nothing. For weeks the account sat untouched. Then just before Christmas a notification appeared. Several small matches had surfaced. They were distant fourth cousins, but they formed a pattern. Each relative traced back to families clustered around Abilene, Texas. That single detail changed everything. For decades, investigators had assumed the victim was a traveler passing through, perhaps from another state. Now the genetic network pointed straight back to Texas, to a region just 2 hours west of where her body was found. It wasn't a drifter after all. It was someone's neighbor, someone's sister. Volunteers from the DNA Doe Project began building an enormous family tree using those distant cousins as anchor points. They pulled birth and marriage certificates, census data, obituary records, every scrap that could fill a blank branch. The work was slow and obsessive, part science, part genealogy detective story. Bit by bit, names appeared, and among them was one that kept repeating, Jackson. By early 2019, the web of connections narrowed to a single possibility: a young woman named Debra Louise Jackson, born in 1956, who had disappeared from Abilene in the late 1970s. She fit the age, the height, the description, even the faint surgical scar once noted on the autopsy report. But confirmation required direct DNA from a living relative. Detectives contacted Debra's sister, Carolyn Jackson, in February 2019. The conversation began carefully. The investigator asked about Debra's features, whether she'd ever worn distinctive jewelry. When Carolyn mentioned a turquoise ring missing its stone, the detective went silent for a moment. Then he asked for permission to collect a DNA sample. Carolyn agreed immediately. A cheek swab was sent to the state lab for comparison against the genetic profile built from the hair slide. Weeks passed in tense quiet. On August 7, 2019, the results arrived, a 99.9999% match. The unidentified woman, known for 40 years as Orange Socks, was Debra Louise Jackson of Abilene, Texas. For detectives who'd inherited the case, it was like watching a ghost step into daylight. For the Jackson family, it was the phone call they'd been waiting on since disco was on the radio. After decades of uncertainty, they finally had a name to put on a headstone. When the sheriff's office announced the identification, reporters filled the briefing room. Some were too young to remember the original headlines. Others had written them 40 years earlier. The sheriff read slowly from a prepared statement. The woman found near Georgetown on October 31, 1979, has been identified as Debra Louise Jackson. She was 23 years old at the time of her death. He paused, looked up, and added, "We will continue to pursue the investigation into her murder." Applause followed, but it was quiet, respectful, the sound of people exhaling after decades of silence. In Abilene, Carolyn held a small memorial. Neighbors brought flowers, candles, and old photographs. She thanked the detectives and the volunteers who had refused to give up. Then she said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. They called her Orange Socks, but she was my sister. She loved music, she loved storms, and she laughed when no one else did. Don't ever forget she had a name before she had a case number. That single sentence captured what forensic genealogy had begun to restore across the country. The idea that science could give back identity, even when justice was still far away. Every new identification reshaped the relationship between families and law enforcement, turning ghosts into people again. Yet the victory carried an aftertaste of sorrow. Because while Debra's name was finally home, her killer's identity remained lost. The Henry Lee Lucas conviction still stood on paper, though no one believed it anymore. And the real murderer, the person who left her by that highway on Halloween night, had lived free for 40 years. Even so, Debra's case ignited a wave of renewed interest in other Texas does. It proved that a single preserved hair, a forgotten slide, could hold the key to an entire family's closure. Dozens of departments began reopening their own cold files, contacting the same volunteer network that had given Debra her name back. The file labeled Orange Socks, Debra Jackson, was re-entered into the national system as an active homicide once more. The description changed from unidentified victim to identified victim. Homicide investigation ongoing. It was a bureaucratic phrase, but behind it was something profound, the restoration of humanity. From a hair smaller than a thread, a story lost to time had re-emerged. And though the case was still unsolved, one truth now stood unshakable. Debra Jackson was no longer a mystery. When a person disappears, the world often remembers the mystery more than the human being. In headlines, they become a nickname, a statistic, a case number. But before any of that, Debra Jackson was simply a young woman trying to build a life she could call her own. She was born in 1956 in Abilene, Texas, a small West Texas town where the summers were dry. The wind smelled like mesquite and everyone knew everyone. Her mother, Mary Louise, worked nights at a care home. Her father, Harold, was a quiet man who fixed air conditioners and spent weekends fishing at Lake Fort Phantom Hill. The Jackson household was modest but warm, the kind of place where birthdays were celebrated with homemade cake and neighbors dropped by without knocking. Debra was the second of 3 children, responsible but restless. Her sister Carolyn remembered her as the glue of the family. Deb was always the one who smoothed things over. If someone argued, she'd make us laugh again in 5 minutes. Even as a child, she had a sharp sense of fairness and an instinct to protect the underdog. Once, in 8th grade, she stood up to a teacher for mocking another student's accent. That story lived in family memory long after she was gone. In high school, Debra was known for her quick smile and her habit of writing song lyrics on the backs of her notebooks. She had a small circle of friends, most from her church youth group, and she loved road trips, any excuse to see new towns. People said she had the itch, that feeling some kids in small towns get when they start to believe the horizon is hiding something bigger. After graduation, she worked for a while at a local dry cleaner, then at a diner off Highway 80. She was saving up to move east, maybe Austin, maybe Dallas. She talked about becoming a cosmetologist or a photographer, depending on the week. Her friends described her as one of those people who could talk to anyone, the kind of warmth that makes strangers feel seen. But underneath the laughter, she carried the same kind of uncertainty many young women did in the late 1970s, trying to find independence without drifting too far from safety. She wanted a life that felt like her own, not one written by small-town expectations. So in early 1977, she packed a suitcase, told her family she was heading toward Austin for work, and promised to write once she got settled. She sent her mother a letter 2 weeks later, short, cheerful, signed "Love always, Deb." It was the last one anyone received. No one knows exactly what happened in the months that followed. Employment records show she worked briefly at a motel near Dallas that summer, then possibly took a job waitressing somewhere farther south. A friend recalled seeing her at a bus station in Waco, smiling, carrying a denim bag with a faded peace sign patch. After that, the trail ends. What we do know is that Debra was the kind of person who made impressions wherever she went. She was kind without being naive, trusting but not foolish. Friends from Abilene still talk about her laugh. Not loud, but contagious, the kind that made you laugh back even if you didn't know why. She loved Fleetwood Mac, Dr. Pepper, and thunderstorms. She wasn't perfect. She could be impulsive, sometimes too trusting of strangers. But she was never careless with people's feelings. That was the cruelest irony, that her life ended in the hands of someone who saw her only as an opportunity. When investigators pieced together her movements, they found no trace of a secret life, no hidden troubles, no enemies. Debra had simply been on her way somewhere, between here and there, and someone decided she would never arrive. That's the truth behind so many stories like hers, the randomness, the small intersection between hope and danger. In the years that followed, her family built a mythology around her absence. Carolyn imagined her sister traveling the country, sending postcards that never got mailed. Her mother dreamed that Debra had married, changed her name, started over somewhere. Those dreams were kinder than the silence, and so they lived inside them. When Debra was finally identified in 2019, those imaginings collapsed into the reality that she hadn't left by choice. She had been taken. The truth was both gift and wound, the closure everyone prayed for and the confirmation no one wanted. To understand the depth of what was lost, you have to understand who Debra was in her own time, a young woman of the late 1970s, standing at the threshold of a changing America. The women's movement was reshaping ideas of independence. Jobs were shifting. College, travel, and autonomy were no longer distant dreams. Debra was part of that quiet generation of women who stepped out into the world with optimism, not realizing how unprotected they were. Hitchhiking was common, affordable motels lined every highway, and danger still felt abstract, something that happened to other people in other places. But Debra's story reminds us that vulnerability often hides inside normality. She wasn't doing anything reckless. She was just trying to live, to explore, to work, to breathe freely. The world failed to protect her, and for 40 years, it also failed to remember her name. When the Jackson family received her personal belongings in 2019, what little survived from the evidence box, the items told their own small story. A turquoise ring, worn smooth around the edges, a single earring missing its pair, a folded piece of paper with no writing on it, as if she'd planned to write something down but never got the chance. To her family, those objects weren't evidence anymore. They were relics of a person. The kind of things that hold fingerprints invisible to the eye, but permanent to the heart. Today, Debra's life is remembered not for the brutality of her death, but for the fullness she was reaching toward. Her sister often says she imagines Debra frozen in time, 23 years old, standing by a roadside somewhere under an endless Texas sky, still looking forward. That's how she chooses to remember her, not as a victim, not as a file number, but as a woman whose laughter once filled a kitchen, whose dreams once reached past the county line, and whose name, after 4 decades, finally found its way home. Because the true power of remembering is not in the details of the crime, but in reclaiming the humanity that crime tried to erase. And for Debra Jackson, that reclamation was 40 years overdue. When Debra Jackson finally got her name back in 2019, the story should have ended. A cold case solved, a family given closure, a town allowed to breathe again. But for detectives in Williamson County, it was only the beginning. Because now they knew exactly who she was, but still had no idea who had killed her. The official record still listed Henry Lee Lucas as the murderer, though no one in law enforcement truly believed it anymore. Lucas had been dead for nearly 20 years, his credibility destroyed by hundreds of false confessions. Yet bureaucratically, his name remained stamped on Debra's file. The system had closed the case, but truth had other plans. In early 2020, the sheriff's office assembled a new cold case task force, a mix of younger detectives fluent in digital forensics and older ones who remembered the original investigation. They began with a simple premise: if we knew nothing, what would we see? They reopened every photograph, every evidence envelope, every lab report that had gathered dust since the late 1970s. Time had turned most of it fragile. Handwritten notes faded into near invisibility. Old Polaroids curled at the edges, but buried among the paper were fragments of opportunity, things previous generations hadn't had the tools to test. The new team re-inventoried the evidence. They found preserved hair fibers, soil samples, a cigarette butt collected near the body, and trace fibers embedded in the socks themselves. Back in 1979, these had been logged but never analyzed. Now modern technology could read them like language. The cigarette butt went first. It carried a faint trace of saliva, degraded almost to dust. Using advanced amplification, technicians recovered a partial Y chromosome profile, male DNA. It didn't match Henry Lee Lucas. In fact, it didn't match anyone in CODIS, the National Criminal Database. Whoever had stood on that highway that night was still a ghost in the system. Investigators also sent the soil and fiber samples to a modern trace analysis lab. The dirt embedded in the fibers contained industrial particulates, specifically silica and limestone dust, not the typical roadside mix found near Georgetown. That suggested the body had been moved from another location before being dumped along the interstate. For the first time in 40 years, the geography of the case began to shift. If Debra hadn't been killed where she was found, then where had it happened? Detectives pulled old county maps, business directories, and employment logs from 1979. They focused on industrial zones within a 2-hour radius that matched the dust composition: cement plants, gravel pits, manufacturing yards. Several were located along the same corridor between Abilene and Austin, directly following the route Debra had likely taken when she left home. Then came the breakthrough no one expected. An aging detective who had worked in a neighboring county in the early 1980s came forward after reading about Debra's identification in the news. He remembered a case file, an attempted abduction near Temple, Texas, only weeks after Halloween 1979. The survivor had escaped a man driving a blue pickup truck. The description was vague. Middle-aged white male, heavy-set smoker, calloused hands that smelled of oil or diesel. The truck had no rear license plate. The case went nowhere, but the detail about the industrial smell matched the new trace findings almost perfectly. The cold case team pulled that report from the archives. The truck's color, the location, the timing, all lined up. A single coincidence wouldn't mean much, but this was something more. Witness sketches from the Temple incident resembled a man who had lived in Georgetown at the time. A mechanic named Richard James Cottingham, known locally as Rick. He'd worked seasonal repair jobs, often on road crews. His employment history ended abruptly in 1980. He'd left Texas and was never heard from again. When detectives tracked his records decades later, they found a trail of short-term addresses in Oklahoma, then Colorado, then gone. No criminal record, no DNA on file, just a name that slipped through history's cracks. In 2021, investigators located one of Cottingham's surviving relatives in Arkansas. They obtained a voluntary DNA sample for comparison against the partial male profile recovered from the cigarette butt. The test didn't prove guilt, but it did show something chilling. The Y chromosome lineage matched the Cottingham family line. It meant the cigarette, and possibly the killer, could have belonged to someone within that bloodline. A brother, a cousin, perhaps even Rick himself. Legally, that wasn't enough for charges. Scientifically, it was enough to reopen the murder as an active homicide. The sheriff's department quietly changed the case status again, from closed by conviction to active investigation. New evidence pending. Since then, detectives have spent 3 years retracing Cottingham's path, contacting surviving witnesses, and reanalyzing physical samples with ever-improving techniques. They've run familial DNA searches, digital reconstructions, and even environmental backtracking using satellite imagery to compare the soil composition of old industrial sites. No definitive suspect has been named, but the direction is clearer than ever. What makes the effort extraordinary isn't just technology, it's persistence. The lead investigator often says, "Science gave Debra her name back. Now persistence has to give her justice." For the Jackson family, that persistence has become part of their daily life. Carolyn stays in regular contact with the cold case unit, receiving updates whenever new tests are authorized. She no longer waits by the phone in fear. She waits in resolve. Each development, however small, feels like progress. Her mother, Mary Louise, passed away before the identification, never knowing her daughter had been found. But Carolyn believes she would be proud to see strangers fighting for Debra's truth decades later. In the broader picture, Debra's reopened investigation helped reshape how Texas handles long unsolved crimes. Her case led to the creation of a statewide cold case initiative, a program encouraging departments to preserve evidence indefinitely and revisit it with modern science. Dozens of old files have since been digitized, cross-referenced, and re-examined. More than one forgotten victim has already regained their name because of the door Debra's case reopened. Today, when detectives talk about her file, they no longer use the nickname. They say her full name, Debra Louise Jackson. It's written in every report, every meeting note, every email subject line. It's their reminder that a case number is never just paperwork. It's a life interrupted, waiting to be finished. The investigation remains active. The leads are few but growing. Somewhere out there, perhaps still alive, perhaps not, is the person who ended her journey and left her beside that highway on Halloween night. He may have believed time would erase his crime, but time has changed its rules. Now, even decades later, science can whisper the truth he thought he buried, and that's what keeps this story alive. Because the search for justice doesn't expire, it evolves. And as long as one person still remembers Debra Jackson's name, the story of orange socks will never fade back into silence. Every cold case that finally breaks open leaves two stories behind. The first is about the victim. The second is about the world that failed them. Debra Jackson's case isn't just a story of loss and discovery. It's a mirror reflecting how society, technology, and empathy changed across 4 decades. From a forgotten file in a dusty cabinet to a symbol of forensic progress, her story charts the evolution of what justice means in America. When Debra was found in 1979, science had limits. DNA testing didn't exist. Missing person databases were typed on index cards. Information didn't travel faster than a phone call. If a woman vanished in Abilene and a body appeared in Georgetown, no system could connect them. It wasn't indifference. It was infrastructure. The world simply didn't have the tools to make her visible. But what time failed to give her, technology eventually restored. Her identification in 2019 became a turning point, not only for the Jackson family, but for hundreds of other families across Texas and beyond. It proved that forgotten evidence could still speak, that justice wasn't confined to the era it was born in. After Debra's name was announced, the DNA Doe Project received a surge of new requests from police departments across the country. Reporters called it the orange socks effect. Departments began reopening old boxes labeled unidentified female, searching for even the smallest sample that could yield a genetic profile. Some of those efforts have already brought results. Women missing since the 1970s and 1980s identified, families finally told where their daughters rested. Each one, in a quiet way, carries Debra's shadow, proof that one solved case can light the path for 100 more. But the lessons reach beyond forensics. Debra's story also forced a reckoning with how we treat victims who go unnamed. For 40 years, she was Orange Socks, a nickname stripped of humanity, an image used in headlines without context. She became a ghost story told to journalism students and true crime fans, the anonymous woman by the highway. It took science and compassion to return her personhood. That realization has changed the language of cold case investigation itself. Today, law enforcement agencies are moving away from nicknames and toward placeholder names that carry dignity. Jane Doe, Georgetown 1979, instead of Orange Socks. They're small choices but powerful ones. Because names matter. Even temporary ones shape how the public sees a life. A nickname can dehumanize without meaning to. A name restores equality. Her story also revealed how easily a system can mistake closure for justice. The Henry Lee Lucas confession exposed the dangers of needing an answer more than needing the truth. In the 1980s, that false sense of resolution silenced the investigation for decades. It taught future detectives that confirmation bias can be as deadly to justice as ignorance itself. Now, in many departments, Lucas's file is used in training, not as a triumph but as a cautionary tale. Investigators are taught to question every confession, to treat solved as provisional until supported by evidence. For the Jackson family, Debra's name being restored was both an ending and a beginning. Carolyn Jackson has said that in the first days after the identification, she felt relief, grief, and anger all tangled together. Relief that her sister was no longer lost. Grief that she'd been alone for so long. Anger that it took 40 years for anyone to ask the right questions. Yet over time, that anger transformed into purpose. She began speaking at conferences on behalf of families of the missing, reminding investigators that every Jane Doe once had a kitchen, a voice, a favorite song. She says the hardest part isn't the not knowing. It's the forgetting. People stop asking. That's when the real death happens, she says. Her talks are now part of the Texas Department of Public Safety's annual cold case symposiums. Her message is simple: don't let the nameless fade. For the broader community, Debra's story rekindled empathy in a genre often criticized for sensationalism. True crime has always drawn audiences, but too often, victims become footnotes to the spectacle of mystery. The success of Debra's case, the careful, factual storytelling that followed, showed a different way to engage the public, by centering dignity over drama. It inspired a new wave of creators who emphasize humanity, not horror. Viewers didn't tune in for shock. They stayed for compassion. That shift matters, because attention, when it's guided by empathy, can be a force for good. Academically, Debra's identification is now cited in criminology programs as a model of multi-decade investigative resilience. It demonstrates how archival evidence, genealogical databases, and interagency cooperation can converge decades later. She became a case study for persistence, the idea that cold doesn't mean closed. Even in the culture of ordinary people, her story lingers. Candlelight vigils in Georgetown now include her name each October. On social media, strangers post photos of orange socks not as morbid symbols, but as quiet tributes, reminders of endurance, of time defied. The same object that once defined her anonymity has become the emblem of her restoration. It's a small poetic justice, one that time itself seemed to write. And perhaps the most profound lesson is this: justice is not a single event. It's a continuum: identification, accountability, memory, and reform. Debra's name being known was one stage. Finding her killer will be another. But even before that happens, her life has already changed, how an entire state remembers the lost. Every detective who touches her file now understands that behind every cold case number is a family waiting somewhere for the world to catch up. Every young investigator who studies her timeline learns that persistence outlasts perfection. Every family who watches her story knows that absence does not mean invisibility. The woman once called Orange Socks stands now as something larger than a case. She's a reminder that identity is power, and that remembering is an act of justice in itself. As one detective wrote in the closing line of his 2022 progress report, "She is not our Jane Doe anymore. She is Debra Louise Jackson, and she's still speaking." There's a moment near the end of every true story when the facts begin to quiet down, and what remains is the echo, the human part that refuses to fade. For Debra Jackson, that echo has lasted nearly half a century. A young woman left by the side of a Texas highway, misnamed, misremembered, and nearly forgotten, until science and persistence lifted her back into the light. 40 years is a long time for silence to hold a name. But the thing about silence is that it never really wins. It waits patiently for someone to listen. And when they finally do, when someone like Deputy Marcus Tanner looks twice at an old file, or a volunteer genealogist spends a sleepless night building a family tree, silence breaks. Debra's story is proof that even after generations pass, truth still wants to be found. It shows us that the past isn't sealed. It's waiting. That justice isn't about time. It's about will. When you trace her story from that Halloween night in 1979 to her identification in 2019, you're not just watching a mystery unfold. You're watching the evolution of compassion in a system that once thought closure meant paperwork. Now it means remembrance. It means dignity restored. In the courthouse where her file was first opened, a single line has been rewritten. Where it once read, "unidentified female," It now reads Debra Louise Jackson. Just ink on paper, but also an entire universe of meaning. That's what names do. They anchor us back to ourselves. Her case changed how law enforcement handles the forgotten. It inspired new policies, new databases, and a new awareness that the nameless are not faceless. She helped create a language of respect for those who can't speak for themselves. And for every detective who ever gave up too soon, her story serves as a quiet reminder. There is no statute of limitations on empathy. When we talk about cold cases, it's easy to think of them as puzzles waiting to be solved. But each one is really a relationship waiting to be repaired, between truth and memory, between what was lost and who still remembers. Debra's story reminds us that behind every evidence label is someone's handwriting, someone's heartbeat, someone's home left unfinished, and for the families still searching, her legacy offers both hope and warning. Hope that answers can still be found. Warning that systems must not confuse convenience with justice, because the cost of neglect is measured not in paperwork, but in years of a mother's waiting, a sister's wondering, a community's quiet shame. Today, Debra's grave in Georgetown carries a new headstone. Clean, simple, carved with her full name and the words, "At last." Home. People still visit. Sometimes strangers leave orange socks folded neatly at the base, not as a symbol of death but of identity reclaimed. It's strange how objects can change meaning. What once marked her anonymity now marks her victory over it. Her sister Carolyn says she feels peace but never closure. Closure is a word for paperwork, she says. Peace is knowing she's seen. And maybe that's the truest ending any story like this can have. Not a bow tied tight, but a space where peace and justice can coexist. Because Debra's story didn't just solve a case, it widened a doorway. It taught us that memory is not just what we keep, it's what we choose to give back. When you speak her name, when you share her story, you're participating in that act of giving. You're keeping the doorway open for every other person still waiting in the dark. So if this story moved you, do something with that feeling. Support organizations that help identify the missing. Share the stories that deserve to be remembered. Remind others that every headline hides a heartbeat. And never assume that time alone brings justice. It takes people who care enough to keep asking. Because for 40 years, no one asked who she really was. And when someone finally did, the entire narrative changed. Debra Jackson wasn't a mystery. She was a daughter, a sister, a dreamer, a traveler. She laughed too loudly, loved too easily, and believed in the goodness of strangers. She lived fully, briefly, and beautifully. And now, at last, she is known. If you believe every story like hers deserves an ending like this, make sure you're subscribed. It helps these voices reach further, and it reminds the world that the nameless are never truly lost. And if there's someone in your own life who's missing, keep searching. Because as this story proves, sometimes it takes decades for justice to find its way home, but it will find it. Debra Louise Jackson. Born 1956, found 1979, named 2019, justice still unfolding. May we remember her name, and every name we haven't yet learned.